For a clothing item to look professional, fit well, lay smooth and flat, a lot has to happen on the inside of the seam and those clean, finished corners. The technique that should get most credit for achieving smooth, flat seams is trimming and grading seam allowance. This is especially important when working with very thick textured fabrics or when sewing self-enclosed corners like those on collars and cuffs, for example. Trimming and grading don't always have to be applied together, but when used together, the smoothest, flattest seams are achieved. While sewing seams is usually as straightforward as applying a machine stitch, handling seam allowance can be a bit trickier. Aside from edge finishing techniques, handling excess bulk and seam tension should also be considered. There are two main techniques you can use to eliminate excess bulk in a seam: trimming the seam allowance and grading the seam allowance. These two methods are sometimes used together or in conjunction with tension release techniques like clipping and notching, especially around very curved seams. Trimming seam allowance simply means cutting down the seam allowance width to about half its size. When needed, it should be done as a preliminary step to the allowance being ironed or clean finished. Trimming not only eliminates unnecessary bulk, it also works to release strain in the seam. The technique of trimming seam allowance is often applied on semi-curved seams like those of the armhole and neckline. Depending on fabric, you may choose to trim the seam allowance on any seam of your choice if you feel that extra allowance shows on the outside of the garment or interacts with how the garment fits. Trimming seam allowance can also be used for construction purposes. Some seam finishing techniques require the seam allowance to be trimmed in the application process. The best example is the construction of a French seam, where the seam allowance is trimmed prior to being self-enclosed for finishing. Anytime you need to trim down seam allowance, you have to consider the fabric at hand. Fabric type determines how close you can trim to the actual stitch line. If you are working with highly fraying or loosely woven fabrics, trim farther away from the stitch line. In some instances, you may only need to trim a portion of the seam allowance. In this case, the seam allowance is trimmed on one end and left untrimmed on the other. To apply this technique, trim the seam allowance partially by gradually blending from one side of the seam to the other. Grading provides a second layer of excess removal by physically thinning the seam allowance layers. This technique is often used on enclosed finished edges, such as those of face necklines and armholes. Grading allows the finished edge to lay flatter and smoother while also eliminating unnecessary bulk in the process. To grade a seam, first, trim the entire seam allowance as described today if necessary. Next, trim the seam allowance edge that does not correspond to the garment layer. Grading is also used with certain seam finishing techniques, such as a flat fell or self-bound. Enclosed fabric corners are those that are clean finished with a self piece or a facing such that all seam allowance is enclosed on the inside of the overlapping layers. An important aspect of sewing enclosed corners is achieving a smooth, flat, defined finish. The only way to achieve a defined corner as such is by trimming the seam allowance excess around the corner stitch prior to flipping the fabric layers to the right side. After the corner has been stitched, follow these steps to trim the excess. Cut the seam allowance diagonally across the corner first. Stay close to the corner point, but not so close that you accidentally clip the stitching. Use your best judgment depending on fabric. Next, trim the seam allowance at an angle on each side of the corner. These two cuts should taper in towards the point and blend into the rest of the seam allowance as they move away from the point. For longer, narrow points, you will need to trim the side seam allowance at a longer, more pronounced angle.